The story begins in a cold, dimly lit chamber of Kensington Palace, where a young Victoria, barely a child, sits alone by a rain-streaked window, her small hands pressed against the glass as silver droplets streak down in irregular patterns, casting fractured reflections of a world she has yet to fully understand. The palace around her hums with a quiet, disciplined life of shadowy servants moving in synchronized silence, the faint clatter of china and distant footsteps echoing through ornate corridors, lined with ancestral portraits whose eyes seem to follow her every movement, reminding her of the legacy she is heir to even as she longs for the laughter and warmth of a life unshackled by duty. And in this solitude, she becomes acutely aware of the duality of her existence, the girl she is and the queen she is destined to become, trapped in a gilded cage where every smile, gesture, and thought must be weighed for its propriety and consequence. Her tutors arrive before dawn, bringing with them a relentless curriculum of history, languages, mathematics, and politics, each lesson less about curiosity than about molding her into the embodiment of an empire that spans continents and oceans, teaching her that knowledge is both a tool and a weapon, a shield to guard against the manipulations of the court, and a torch to illuminate the path of rule she must one day walk alone. And yet, despite the rigor and the endless expectations, Victoria discovers secret avenues of rebellion, small acts of defiance that allow her to taste freedom even in confinement, sketching imaginary lands in hidden notebooks, writing letters she will never send, or stealing brief moments in the palace gardens, where the wind carries whispers of a life she might have lived had the crown not dictated her every move. These gardens, with their bending branches, rustling leaves, and the occasional burst of sunlight breaking through the clouds, become her sanctuary, a place where the weight of expectation lifts ever so slightly, rather than a sovereign in training. And yet, her isolation sharpens her senses, attuning her to subtleties others overlooked: the nervous twitch of a servant, the tension in her mother's posture, the fleeting flicker of doubt in her father's gaze, each observation a lesson in the silent power dynamics of those who serve and those who rule, teaching her early that authority is earned through patience, perception, and sometimes quiet cunning. Nights are the loneliest when the candles gutter and the corridors fall silent, leaving her alone with the echo of her own heartbeat, forcing her to confront the stark truth of her existence, that greatness, though intoxicating in promise, demands a sacrifice of personal freedom and intimacy, and that her childhood will continue to be defined by duty rather than desire. And as Victoria gazes out through the rain-streaked window into the gray expanse beyond, there is a flicker of understanding in her eyes, a recognition that the path ahead is both terrifying and magnificent, that the girl who longs for ordinary joys must become a figure capable of extraordinary endurance. And in that quiet, reflective moment, framed by the soft melancholy of rain and the silent grandeur of a palace that holds both history and expectation, the first seeds of the queen she is destined to become are sown, shaped by isolation, tempered by observation, and quietly, invisibly, hardened into the steel of resilience that will define not only her reign, but the very image of monarchy itself. The world shifts in an instant the morning Victoria turns 18, when a messenger enters her chamber with pale, urgent features to deliver news that her uncle, King William IV, has died, and with that, the young princess, who only yesterday had wandered the palace corridors as if they were her private domain, is now the sovereign of the British Empire, a weight so enormous it presses against her chest, as if the walls themselves conspired to remind her that she is no longer merely a child in a gilded cage, but the embodiment of a realm stretching from the misty cliffs of Scotland to the bustling ports of India and beyond. And as the realization settles over her like a thick fog, she feels the gravity of 1,000 expectations, the judgment of countless ancestors, and the silent scrutiny of a nation she barely understands, all converging upon her fragile shoulders. The coronation, when it comes, is a spectacle both dazzling and terrifying, a procession through Westminster Abbey, where the walls seem to close in under the weight of history, the regalia glinting with centuries of power, the clergy, nobles, and dignitaries watching every expression, every movement, every subtle shift of her posture for signs of readiness or weakness. And in that moment, Victoria's mind races through the lessons of her youth's meticulous study of law, politics, and diplomacy, the endless etiquette drills, the hours of practicing formal speech, all designed to prepare her for this precise instant when the fragile thread between adolescence and sovereignty is stretched to its breaking point. Yet even as the public eyes of the empire bear down upon her, there is a tumult within, a storm of fear, exhilaration, and disbelief. For she knows that her personal desires, her fleeting dreams of ordinary life, are now luxuries she can no longer afford, that every choice she makes will ripple across continents, that the crown is more than a symbol or ornament, it is a living entity demanding obedience, vigilance, and endurance. Her first days on the throne are a dizzying blur of appointments, consultations, and ceremonies, ministers presenting petitions, ambassadors pressing for concessions, courtiers circling with quiet ambition, all while Victoria struggles to reconcile the immense responsibilities laid upon her with the lingering ache of her lost childhood. Yet, even in this overwhelming new existence, she begins to sense the subtle power of observation, noting the glances, the hesitations, the barely perceptible tension in the voices of those who serve and advise her, understanding that authority is as much about perception as it is about decree, that ruling is as much about insight as it is about command. And slowly, she begins to navigate the delicate dance of influence, learning which words to speak, which gestures to make, and which silences to maintain. And as night falls on her first week as queen, Victoria stands alone in her chamber, framed against the tall, shadowed windows, the city beyond glittering faintly under the soft glow of gas lamps, feeling the full magnitude of what it means to hold a crown. And for the first time, she senses both the thrill and the isolation of power, knowing that her reign has begun not with certainty, but with an unspoken promise of struggle, triumph, and personal sacrifice. And in that quiet, cinematic moment, the young queen, so small and vulnerable in the expanse of history, understands that from this point forward, every breath she takes, every glance she casts, every decision she makes will ripple through time, shaping not only the empire she now governs, but the very story of herself, a girl thrust into greatness, poised to grow into a monarch whose shadow will stretch long after her own fleeting heartbeat. The palace, once a labyrinth of quiet halls and predictable routines, now pulses with a new energy, a mixture of reverence and subtle menace. As Victoria begins to understand that ascending the throne is not merely a matter of ceremony, but an initiation into a world where loyalty is measured in whispers and power is wielded as much in shadow as in light. Every corridor she walks, every drawing room she enters, is filled with eyes that watch, analyze, and sometimes judge. Courtiers whose smiles are often masks, advisors whose words carry hidden intentions, and ministers who see in her youth a canvas to mold or manipulate. She quickly learns that etiquette is not only a form of politeness, but a weapon, a language through which alliances are formed and betrayals are disguised. And she realizes that every gesture, from the tilt of her head to the pause in her voice, must be deliberate, precise, and observant of the invisible currents swirling around her. Because in this court, a misstep can be fatal to reputation, influence, or even peace within the realm. Victoria studies the subtle power games with the intensity of a scholar, noting who defers, who asserts, who smiles with sincerity, and who smiles with cunning. And in doing so, she begins to cultivate her own presence, learning the delicate art of command without overt force, of authority conveyed through demeanor, posture, and quiet resolve. Yet the court is not merely a place of political calculation. It is also a crucible of loneliness, a space where personal connections are fleeting, suspicion is constant, and true companionship is nearly impossible to find. So Victoria often retreats to her private chambers, walking among the tapestries and gilded furniture, pondering the isolation that comes with greatness, reflecting on the life she once imagined, and feeling the weight of expectations pressing upon her, knowing that every decision she makes, from the allocation of funds to the endorsement of a minister, will reverberate across the empire and beyond. And in these moments of quiet, she observes the faces of her attendants, the subtle gestures of her ladies-in-waiting, the barely perceptible sighs of her advisors, learning to read the unspoken language of power, understanding that a queen's strength is forged as much from discernment as from command, and that the survival of her reign depends not only on knowledge of law and policy, but on intuition, empathy, and the ability to anticipate desires, fears, and ambitions hidden beneath polite words. Yet even as she navigates these treacherous waters, Victoria allows herself small acts of rebellion and humanity, finding solace in brief walks through the palace gardens, where the air smells of wet earth and blooming flowers, where birds take flight with a freedom she envies, and where, for fleeting moments, she can imagine being a girl again, unburdened by crown or ceremony, dreaming of adventures beyond the palace walls. But reality is never far, and the court's intrigues follow her into these sanctuaries, whispering reminders of duty and consequence. And as she stands beneath the bending branches, feeling the sun break through clouds to light her path, she senses both the weight and the thrill of the game she must play, a game of perception, intelligence, and endurance, knowing that each encounter, each decision, each subtle observation will shape not only her reign, but the very legacy of monarchy in Britain. And as dusk falls, the palace corridors grow long and shadowed, the echoes of conversation fading into silence, and Victoria, alone in her chamber once more, feels the quiet tension of triumph and anxiety, realizing that while she has survived the formalities of her ascent, the real challenge has only begun: the intricate, delicate, and often perilous dance of power within the court, where every smile, every gesture, every word could be a key to influence or a trap, and where the young queen must learn to navigate the unseen currents that will define her reign, her character, and the course of history itself. Victoria soon discovers that the crown is not simply a symbol of power, but a relentless force demanding constant vigilance, and that every decision she makes, no matter how small, carries consequences that ripple across kingdoms, touching lives she will never meet and shaping events she cannot foresee. The early days of her reign are filled with meetings in dimly lit council chambers, where ministers present petitions, advisors debate strategies, and diplomats whisper of alliances and threats, and she must absorb volumes of information with the acuity of a seasoned scholar, while maintaining a composure that belies the storm of doubt and fear swirling within her. For any display of uncertainty could embolden rivals or weaken the perception of her authority. Yet, the burden of decision is not only political, it is deeply personal. For Victoria feels the weight of expectations from every direction, the invisible judgment of a nation that sees her not as a young woman with desires and dreams, but as the embodiment of the empire itself. And this tension shapes every action, every pause, every glance, forcing her to navigate a world where mistakes are magnified and mercy is scarce, where a single misstep in diplomacy, policy, or personal conduct could ignite scandal or jeopardize alliances. Even the simplest of choices, a decree issued, a meeting called, becomes a test of wisdom, patience, and insight. And Victoria quickly learns that the greatest skill a monarch can possess is the ability to listen, to observe, and to weigh not just facts but human emotions, ambitions, and fears, recognizing that power is as much psychological as it is institutional. That influence often comes from subtle persuasion rather than overt command, and that the throne demands a mind attuned to nuance, capable of reading the hidden currents beneath formal speech and ceremony. Amidst the constant pressure, Victoria seeks moments of clarity and respite, retreating to her private chambers or wandering the palace gardens, where the wind carries faint scents of damp earth and flowers, where birds flutter among trees in a freedom she envies, and where the sounds of water trickling from fountains offer a temporary solace from the relentless expectations that surround her. Yet, even in these moments, the burden of duty intrudes. For the empire does not pause for contemplation, and she must constantly remind herself that every decision, no matter how isolated it may seem, has consequences that extend beyond her personal world. Slowly, she begins to cultivate the intuition and resilience that will define her reign, learning to distinguish between counsel that is sincere and advice that conceals ulterior motives, to measure risk against principle, and to balance compassion with firmness, understanding that true leadership demands both courage and restraint. The nights are long, often sleepless, filled with reflection, strategy, and sometimes anxiety, as Victoria contemplates treaties, taxation, and reforms. Yet she also senses that these challenges are forging her character, molding the young girl into a queen capable of steering not only the machinery of government, but the hearts of her people. and as twilight descends upon the palace, casting shadows across the gilded halls and reflecting off polished marble floors, Victoria stands alone, gazing out the high windows at the sprawling city below, feeling simultaneously the exhilaration and isolation of sovereignty, understanding that the burden she bears is immense, unending, and lonely, yet also recognizing that within this weight lies her power. The power to shape history, to influence lives, and to define an era. And in that quiet, cinematic moment, framed by fading light and the silent grandeur of a palace that has witnessed centuries of kings and queens, she senses that her reign will be measured not only by victories and policies, but by the resilience, wisdom, and humanity she brings to each decision. Knowing that the true test of monarchy is not the crown itself, but the person who wears it. Despite the grandeur, the protocol, and the endless ceremonies that fill the days of her reign, Victoria begins to feel a profound and inescapable loneliness, a shadow that clings to her even in the brightest of rooms. For while she commands armies, legislates laws, and presides over a vast empire, there are few who truly see her as a person rather than a symbol. Her advisors, ministers, and courtiers bow and speak with measured deference, but their loyalty is often tempered by ambition or expectation, their words carefully crafted to curry favor or conceal hidden agendas. And even her closest attendants cannot pierce the walls of vigilance she must maintain. Walls built over years of training, observation, and the relentless understanding that to show vulnerability is to invite danger. The young queen, who once longed for simple joys and moments of private delight, now navigates a world where every smile is scrutinized, every gesture interpreted, every emotion weighed against the eternal standards of monarchy. And in these quiet moments, she is forced to confront the cost of power, realizing that the crown demands not only sacrifice of freedom but also the surrender of intimacy, friendship, and the ordinary companionships that define a human life. Yet even within this isolation, Victoria finds solace in her memories, her studies, and the fleeting moments of connection she can create with nature or art. Retreating to palace gardens where the sunlight flickers through leaves, where birdsong punctuates the heavy silence of responsibility, and where fountains ripple with a serenity that feels almost forbidden in a life dictated by duty, allowing her to remember the girl she once was and the dreams she still secretly harbors. The corridors of the palace, lined with opulent portraits of monarchs past, serve as both a reminder of legacy and a mirror to her solitude, each gaze from painted eyes seeming to question her resolve, her wisdom, her capacity to balance personal desire with public expectation. And as she walks these halls alone, she senses the immense gravity of history pressing down upon her, shaping her every decision, every thought, and every heartbeat, forging the contours of a character tempered by observation, restraint, and resilience. The nights are particularly merciless, when the flickering candlelight casts dancing shadows across high ceilings and echoing halls, and Victoria, often alone in her chamber, confronts the silent truths of monarchy, that power is inseparable from loneliness, that admiration often masks distance, and that the intimacy of ordinary life is a treasure she can no longer claim without consequence. For even familial relationships are tinged with protocol, suspicion, and the ever-present awareness that she is first queen, second woman, And yet, in this solitude, a quiet strength, a recognition that loneliness can also be clarity, that isolation can sharpen judgment, cultivate empathy, and prepare her for the complexities of a reign that will stretch decades into the future, allowing her to act decisively, observe meticulously, and endure patiently. And as she gazes out the high windows at the city below, lights twinkling like scattered stars, Victoria understands that this shadow of loneliness is not merely a burden, but a crucible, forging the resilience, wisdom, and depth that will define her legacy. And in that cinematic, almost haunting moment, the young queen alone, contemplative, yet unyielding, embraces the reality that the crown demands everything, and in surrendering herself to its weight, she begins to shape not only the empire, but the very essence of her own indomitable spirit. As the initial weeks of her reign settle into routine, Victoria begins to recognize that the crown is less a possession and more a living, breathing force that demands constant negotiation, observation, and endurance. And she understands that her role as queen is not simply to rule by decree, but to embody the continuity, strength, and presence of a monarchy that stretches across oceans and centuries. For every gesture she makes, every word she utters, and every decision she enacts will echo through the lives of millions, shaping not only the present but the future of an empire too vast to comprehend fully. She rises early, often before dawn, walking the echoing corridors of Buckingham Palace with measured steps, her eyes tracing the lines of gilded walls, polished floors, and portraits that remind her of kings and queens who came before, their gazes seeming to weigh her worth, her resolve, and the fidelity with which she will carry their legacy. And she realizes that she must not only understand the machinery of government, persuasion, and presence, cultivating the ability to inspire loyalty, command respect, and detect duplicity before it can manifest. In council chambers, she listens intently to ministers who speak in layered arguments, weighing trade, taxation, military strategy, and diplomacy, parsing the hidden meanings between words, the unspoken tensions, and the ambitions lurking behind each polite gesture, all while maintaining a composed demeanor that suggests confidence far beyond her years. And through this relentless observation, Victoria begins to understand the duality of leadership, the balance between assertion and restraint, between intellect and emotion, between firmness and compassion, and to internalize that a monarch's strength is often measured not in the overt exercise of power, but in the quiet, deliberate orchestration of circumstance and perception. Even in moments of solitude, she contemplates the enormity of the responsibility she carries, walking through private gardens where the morning mist clings to the petals of roses, where birds rise in flight above the dukest lawns, and where the gentle ripple of fountains mirrors the ceaseless flow of decisions she must make. And it is here, amid the serenity of nature's quiet rhythms, that she allows herself to reflect, to imagine, and to refine her understanding of the woman she must become to match the monarch the empire demands, recognizing that wisdom, patience, and resilience are as critical as intelligence, lineage, and ceremony. The young queen also begins to experiment with personal authority, asserting preferences in the running of the household, testing the temperaments of her advisors, and observing how courtiers react to subtle cues. learning that influence often comes from nuanced observation, from knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, when to show strength and when to allow the perception of vulnerability, and that the most effective rule is as much about timing, perception, and empathy as it is about legislation or protocol. Yet, as Victoria grows into this understanding, she remains acutely aware of the isolation that accompanies her power, the private moments in which she is not a symbol but a human being, longing for companionship, for laughter, for the freedom to move without scrutiny. And in these quiet, cinematic reflections, she realizes that the formation of a monarch is as much an internal process as an external one, a forging of character in the crucible of expectation, responsibility, and observation. And as the sun rises over the palace rooftops, bathing the corridors and gardens in golden light, Victoria feels the stirrings of confidence, clarity, and determination, understanding that while her reign has only just begun, the foundations of the Queen she will become resolute, perceptive, and unyielding are already being forged in the silent, measured rhythms of her daily life, and that in embracing both the weight and the discipline of her role, she is shaping not only the empire, but the enduring essence of her own indomitable spirit. Victoria soon learns that the crown, while magnificent, is an unrelenting teacher, offering lessons in patience, strategy, and human nature that no tutor or book could have prepared her for. For every decision she makes carries consequences far beyond the palace walls, touching lives she may never see and shaping events that will ripple across continents. And in this realization, she begins to understand that true power is as much about restraint and observation as it is about authority. That influence is cultivated not through decree alone, but through perception, empathy, and the ability to anticipate the desires and fears of those who serve her and those who seek to challenge her. She spends countless hours in council chambers and private meetings, listening to ministers debate taxation, trade, military action, and diplomacy, parsing each statement for hidden motives, assessing body language, tone, and timing, recognizing that even a slight pause or carefully chosen word can reveal ambition, duplicity, or allegiance, and that the capacity to read people is as vital to rulership as understanding law or policy. For a sovereign must navigate not only the mechanics of governance, but the intricate web of human emotion and ambition that surrounds them. Victoria's mornings often begin before the first light of dawn, walking through echoing halls where tapestries depict kings and queens of the past, their gazes seemingly challenging her to measure up to their legacy, while afternoons are consumed by formal audiences in which foreign ambassadors, military officials, and noble petitioners approach with careful etiquette and hidden agendas, all vying for her favor, all testing her capacity to assert authority with diplomacy, and all reminding her that a misjudgment can have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Yet, even in the midst of this whirlwind, she finds time for quiet reflection, retreating to private chambers or the palace gardens where she observes the delicate interplay of sunlight on leaves, the gentle ripple of fountains, and the unpredictable flight of birds, seeing in nature's rhythms a metaphor for leadership itself, the balance of order and chaos, of freedom and restraint, of control and observation. Here, in these rare moments of solitude, Victoria contemplates the subtleties of influence, the weight of choice, and the importance of intuition. Understanding that a monarch's power is not merely measured in legislation or command, but in the capacity to perceive, to respond with both firmness and wisdom, and to shape events through presence, insight, and timing. As the days stretch into months, she begins to cultivate these skills with increasing confidence, learning when to intervene, when to allow events to unfold, when to reward loyalty, when to temper ambition, and when to stand firm against those who would seek to manipulate her inexperience. Understanding that leadership requires a delicate balance between vigilance and trust, between empathy and authority, and between personal conviction and political necessity. Yet, even as Victoria gains confidence, the lessons of power are accompanied by profound solitude. The realization that the demands of monarchy are unending, that intimacy is rare, that personal desire is often subordinated to duty, and that the crown, while granting authority, exacts a price in emotional isolation and relentless responsibility. And in the quiet, cinematic moments at dusk, as shadows stretch across the palace gardens and golden light bathes the corridors she has come to know so intimately, Victoria reflects on the duality of her existence, both young woman and sovereign, both vulnerable and formidable, and recognizes that the lessons she has learned, hard-earned and ongoing, are forging the monarch she is destined to become. Perceptive, resilient, and unwavering, prepared to wield her power not as an instrument of fear, but as a tool of measured influence, shaping not only her empire, but the legacy of the woman she is becoming. As Victoria navigates the labyrinth of court life, she quickly realizes that the crown brings with it a complex network of relationships, some forged in genuine loyalty, others in calculated self-interest, and that her survival and her ability to rule effectively depends as much on understanding these human dynamics as it does on knowledge of law or statecraft. For the people around her are neither mere servants nor empty courtiers. They are actors in a delicate dance of influence, each with ambitions, fears, and secrets she must learn to read with precision. And in doing so, she discovers that alliances can shift as quickly as shadows across palace walls, that friends can become rivals overnight, and that enemies can hide behind the mask of civility, smiling while plotting subtle manipulations designed to test, control, or undermine her. In council chambers, Victoria studies ministers who argue with, noting the slight tremor in a hand, the hesitation in a bow, the sharp glint in an eye, learning to interpret these as clues to their true intentions and to weigh the merit of their counsel against the hidden agendas they carry. Understanding that the skill of discerning motive is as vital as the ability to issue decrees or command armies, and that in the intricate interplay of personalities, patience and observation are far more powerful than impulsive authority. Yet, amidst this sea of careful calculation, Victoria begins to find pockets of genuine connection, discovering allies who share her vision, advisors whose loyalty is steadfast, and confidants who offer insight without expectation of gain. And she learns to nurture these relationships with care, knowing that true support can be the difference between success and failure, stability and turmoil. The young queen also begins to recognize the importance of subtle gestures, a private word of encouragement, a carefully timed expression of approval, a discreet recognition of effort, all of which build trust, shape perception, and fortify loyalty in ways that formal authority alone cannot. And she becomes increasingly adept at balancing the demands of her official role with the cultivation of human relationships that strengthen her position while maintaining the necessary boundaries demanded by her rank. Yet, even in these moments of strategic camaraderie, Victoria remains vigilant, aware that allies can falter and adversaries can strike when least expected, and that the palace is a theater in which loyalty, rivalry, and ambition play out continuously, often in whispers, sideways glances, and subtle gestures that reveal more than words ever could. And she develops a sharp intuition, a sense of timing and judgment that allows her to anticipate, respond, and sometimes manipulate outcomes in ways that preserve her authority while maintaining the appearance of fairness and impartiality. Outside the council chambers and private meetings, she observes the broader world of aristocracy, the interplay of marriage, inheritance, and patronage, recognizing that the network of influence extends far beyond the walls of Buckingham or Windsor, touching families, communities, and the very structure of British society, and that her ability to navigate these layers of loyalty and competition will define not only her reign, but the stability and prosperity of the empire itself. And in the quiet moments of reflection, often in the gardens, where sunlight dapples leaves and fountains murmur softly, Victoria contemplates the delicate balance between vigilance and trust, between asserting authority and fostering alliances. And she understands that the monarch she is becoming must possess a mind both analytical and empathetic, a heart disciplined yet perceptive, capable of recognizing not only the intentions of those who surround her, but the long-term consequences of every interaction, every favor, every decision. And as the day fades into evening, casting long cinematic shadows across palace corridors, Victoria stands poised, aware of both the allies she can count on and the adversaries who watch and wait. And she feels the quiet thrill and weight of mastery beginning to take hold within her, shaping the sovereign who will command with wisdom, navigate with strategy, and endure with the resilience that only experience, observation, and insight can forge. Victoria quickly realizes that the monarchy is not only a courtly institution, but a living symbol watched, admired, and judged by millions, and that her every action carries the scrutiny of a public whose expectations are often as heavy and unyielding as the crown itself. For the eyes of the empire extend far beyond palace walls, into bustling streets, crowded markets, distant colonies, and even the smallest villages, where people measure her not only by the policies she enacts, but by the dignity, composure, and moral example she projects. And she understands that the facade of authority, grace, and decisiveness must be unbroken, for any hint of doubt or imperfection could be magnified, misinterpreted, or exploited by both allies and adversaries. Alike, the young queen spends countless hours receiving petitions, attending public ceremonies, and reviewing reports of social and political unrest, all while meticulously crafting the public image she presents, learning that the crown demands not just action, but perception, that power is as much a performance as it is an institution, and that to maintain the confidence of her subjects, she must project both strength and empathy, authority and humanity in perfect balance. Every walk through palace corridors, every address from a balcony, every signature on a document becomes a measured act of communication, conveying competence, compassion, and stability. And she learns to observe the reactions of those around her: the tilt of a head, the fervor of applause, the whispers of discontent as indicators of perception and sentiment. Understanding that to govern successfully, she must anticipate not only the needs of ministers and diplomats, but the desires, fears, and hopes of an entire nation. Yet this constant attention to public expectation brings both exhilaration and pressure, as Victoria finds herself negotiating the duality of being revered yet perpetually observed, admired yet criticized, celebrated yet bound by the relentless standards of decorum, morality, and tradition. And she feels the weight of history pressing upon her, reminding her that the monarchy is not static, that each reign leaves an imprint, and that her choices will echo long after her voice has faded. Amidst these pressures, she seeks moments of reflection in private, wandering palace gardens or walking along quiet corridors where sunlight filters through high windows, observing the patterns of nature and finding in their predictability a metaphor for the order she must bring to a sometimes chaotic empire. Yet, even in these solitary moments, she cannot fully escape the awareness of public scrutiny, the invisible gaze of millions shaping her posture, her words, and even her thoughts. Gradually, Victoria begins to harness this scrutiny as a tool rather than a burden, learning that public expectation, when understood and respected, can guide action, reinforce authority, and inspire loyalty. That her persona as monarch is both armor and instrument, diplomacy or statecraft. And as evening descends, casting cinematic shadows across palace walls and gardens, Victoria stands alone in a high-windowed chamber, gazing out at the sprawling city below, feeling both the exhilaration and gravity of her role. Aware that the people she serves are not passive observers, but active participants in the subtle dialogue of monarchy, and that to meet their expectations while preserving her integrity, judgment, and vision, she must continue to refine not only the actions of her reign, but the very presence and essence of the sovereign she is becoming, a queen who embodies resilience, insight, and the unwavering balance of public duty and personal strength, poised to endure the scrutiny and shape the future of an empire that stretches farther than her eyes can see. As Victoria settles into the rhythm of her reign, she begins to understand that true power is measured not only in decisions made or ceremonies attended, but in the quiet resilience that allows a sovereign to endure the unrelenting pressures of expectation, isolation, and scrutiny for the crown, while magnificent in appearance is relentless in demand, requiring a constant balance between authority and empathy, observation and action, public performance and private reflection. And Victoria soon realizes that the fortitude she cultivates in solitude is as crucial to her success as the strategies she debates in council chambers or the policies she signs into law. Each morning, before dawn, she walks through the echoing corridors of her palace, the air still and heavy with the faint scent of candle wax and polished wood, feeling the gravity of history pressing upon her, aware that every step she takes, every gesture she makes carries symbolic weight, and that the resilience she displays measured, composed, unwavering communicates as much to her subjects and advisors as any speech or decree could. For a queen must be both anchor and compass, guiding her people while remaining steadfast against uncertainty, doubt, and intrigue. In the palace gardens, where mist clings to the rose beds and fountains ripple softly in the morning light, Victoria finds moments of introspection, where the quiet murmur of nature mirrors the reflective processes that shape her decisions, and she learns to draw strength from these moments, understanding that endurance is cultivated as much in contemplation as in action, and that solitude, though often painful, can refine judgment, sharpen perception, and forge inner fortitude. Amidst the demands of public ceremonies, audiences, and diplomatic negotiations, she hones her capacity to balance expectation with autonomy, listening carefully to ministers, discerning the motives of courtiers, and measuring the pulse of the nation, all while maintaining a composed exterior, for she recognizes that vulnerability, if exposed too freely, can invite manipulation or doubt. Yet she also discovers that controlled openness, the subtle sharing of insight or empathy, can build trust, loyalty, and influence, demonstrating that resilience is not merely endurance, but strategic engagement with the human elements of power. As years pass, Victoria confronts crisis, political tension, social unrest, and personal loss that test both her intellect, and each challenge strengthens the subtle network of endurance she is weaving within herself, revealing that the most enduring leaders are not those who rely solely on authority or tradition, but those who cultivate adaptability, insight, and emotional strength, capable of responding to crises with calm deliberation and unwavering integrity, even in moments of loneliness, when the palace feels like both a fortress and a cage. She allows herself to find comfort in books, music, and fleeting conversations, small threads of humanity that sustain her without diminishing her authority, reminding her that resilience encompasses not only firmness and strategy, but also the preservation of one's sense of self and humanity. And as twilight casts cinematic shadows across her private chambers and the palace gardens, Victoria stands alone at a window, gazing at the vast empire that stretches beyond her sight, feeling both the weight and the majesty of her position, aware that the quiet strength she has nurtured, born from observation, discipline, and reflection, will carry her through triumph and tribulation alike, shaping her reign, influencing generations, and defining not only the monarch she has become, but the enduring spirit of a woman who embraced solitude, scrutiny, and responsibility with unwavering courage, learning that the crown, heavy though it may be, is not merely a burden, but a forge in which resilience, wisdom, and legacy are forged with deliberate, unyielding care. Even amidst the endless duties of monarchy, Victoria begins to feel the subtle stirrings of a heart that longs for connection beyond the strict confines of palace life, a yearning that clashes with the relentless expectations of her position and the rigid protocols that govern every interaction. She notices the world outside her chambers, the laughter of young women at court, the fleeting smiles of diplomats, the warmth of familial affection she rarely experiences, as both temptation and reminder that the life she might have lived is inaccessible. Yet, within these observations, a seed of possibility begins to grow, the awareness that even a queen is not immune to the human desire for companionship, intimacy, and love, a truth she must navigate with caution and subtlety, for a misstep could jeopardize her reputation, her authority, and the perception of the monarchy itself. The young queen is drawn to those who inspire curiosity, respect, and admiration, and she quickly learns that the balance of personal feeling and public duty is delicate, requiring both discretion and discernment. For while the heart may seek warmth, the crown commands vigilance, and every interaction must be weighed not only for emotion, but for its potential consequence across a sprawling empire that observes every action of its sovereign with magnified attention. Yet, even within these constraints, Victoria begins to experience moments of private joy, the kind that cannot be dictated by protocol or ceremony. Small gestures that ignite a spark of humanity, kind word, a shared laugh, a fleeting moment of genuine understanding, and she treasures them fiercely, knowing they are rare and fragile in a world dominated by hierarchy, scrutiny, and the constant weight of expectation. As she continues to observe the world around her, she encounters individuals whose intelligence, temperament, and dignity evoke admiration and curiosity, challenging her to consider the possibility of companionship on her own terms. A thought, for it forces her to confront the tension between personal desire and sovereign duty, between the life she could imagine and the life she must lead, and she begins to understand that love, like power, requires careful navigation, insight, and courage, and that emotional connection, if pursued recklessly, can become both vulnerability and weapon, exposing her to manipulation, scandal, or distraction from the relentless obligations of rule. In the quiet chambers of Buckingham and Windsor, she allows herself to contemplate the duality of her existence, balancing the exhilaration of personal awakening with the gravity of her responsibilities, recognizing that the human heart is both a source of joy and a potential crucible, capable of strengthening character or revealing weakness. And she begins to cultivate the subtle art of emotional self-awareness, understanding her own desires, limits, and capacity for trust. Yet, even as these feelings stir, they are tempered by the lessons of solitude, observation, and resilience she has cultivated in her early years as queen. For Victoria knows that to maintain authority, she must never surrender control completely, must always weigh consequence against emotion, must always navigate the treacherous intersection of personal and public life. And in the gardens of her palace, where sunlight filters through branches and the soft murmur of fountains punctuates the still air, she allows herself to imagine a life in which heart and duty coexist, a fleeting vision of possibility that fuels her resolve rather than diminishes it. And as the day fades into cinematic twilight, casting long, reflective shadows across corridors and lawns, Victoria feels the first tremors of what will become one of the most profound and defining journeys of her life, the delicate negotiation of love, loyalty, and duty, a dance that will challenge her spirit, shape her character, and leave a mark upon her reign as enduring and complex as the empire itself. Amidst the rigid schedules, ceremonial obligations, and ceaseless scrutiny of court life, Victoria experiences a rare and startling moment of connection, one that awakens feelings both exhilarating and frightening, for it challenges the carefully constructed boundaries she has maintained since ascending the throne. The encounter is simple, yet profound, a meeting with someone whose presence commands respect, whose intelligence stimulates her curiosity, and whose manner conveys a warmth and sincerity so rare in a world dominated by observation protocol and subtle ambition that it feels almost like breathing fresh air after years of confinement. A fleeting glimpse of a life unshackled by crown or duty, yet weighted by all the gravity of consequence. In these moments, Victoria finds herself both drawn and cautious, recognizing the delicate balance she must strike between the stirrings of personal desire and the imperatives of public expectation. For every word she utters, every gesture she makes, is potentially magnified into historical significance. And yet, the sincerity of this connection, however brief or tentative, illuminates within her a dimension of human experience she has long been denied: the thrill of trust, the spark of admiration, the subtle intimacy of shared thought. She notices the small details, the quiet expressions, the unspoken understanding, and realizes that influence, authority, and affection are all intertwined in ways she has never fully contemplated, that a bondif carefully nurtured can offer both solace and strength, enhancing her capacity to navigate the complexities of her reign, while also allowing her to experience the delicate joys of human companionship. Yet, the awareness of risk tempers her exhilaration, for the court is always watching, and her reputation, the perception of her strength, and the stability of the monarchy itself depend on discretion, poise, and foresight, and she must tread carefully, balancing her own desires with the imperatives of duty, knowing that to succumb blindly to emotion could imperil the very foundations she has fought to understand, maintain, and strengthen. In her private chambers, she reflects on this connection, replaying conversations, gestures, and expressions in her mind, analyzing their significance, pondering the potential for trust, and measuring the risks of openness against the rewards of human closeness. For she understands that to navigate both power and affection is to engage in a subtle, high-stakes dance where the smallest misstep can reverberate across corridors, council tables, and even continents. And yet, despite the tension between longing and caution, Victoria begins to recognize the transformative potential of this bond, the way it illuminates her own capacity for empathy, courage, and emotional resilience, how it challenges her to see beyond protocol and observation, and how it reminds her that even a monarch shaped by duty, isolation, and relentless expectation is still human, capable of deep feeling, subtle joy, and quiet companionship. In the gardens, under the shifting light of afternoon, she contemplates the possibility that this connection, if approached with wisdom, patience, and careful discernment, could become a source of strength, a partnership that enriches her life without undermining her authority, a delicate balance between heart and crown that may teach her as much about herself as it does about the art of governing. And as the sun dips lower, casting cinematic, golden shadows across the palace corridors and gardens, Victoria feels a mixture of exhilaration, apprehension, and profound clarity, understanding that love and delicate and rare can coexist with duty, that emotional connection can enhance rather than compromise power, and that the path she begins to navigate is one that will challenge her, refine her, and leave an indelible mark upon both her reign and her heart, shaping the queen she is becoming with depth, subtlety, and an unspoken courage that reaches far beyond the gilded walls of the palace. As the tender stirrings of affection take root within Victoria, she is confronted with the relentless tension between personal longing and sovereign duty, a conflict that twists and turns through every thought, gesture, and decision she makes. For the crown, with its weight of expectation, tradition, and scrutiny, allows little room for the indulgences of the heart, and she realizes that the very impulses that make her human, the desire for companionship, the spark of emotional connection, the quiet joy of intimacy must be measured against the monumental responsibilities she bears, the stability of the empire she represents, and the perception of her subjects, who watch her every move with reverence, expectation, and curiosity in her private chambers. She paces the polished floors, hand resting on the edge of a marble table, the sunlight streaming through tall windows, illuminating both her face and the metaphorical shadows cast by this conflict. And she understands that every smile exchanged, every private word shared, every lingering glance must be tempered by discretion, for even the smallest lapse could ripple outward, fueling rumor, weakening alliances, or undermining her authority. And she feels the tension of knowing that to embrace desire fully could endanger the very foundation of her reign, while to suppress it entirely could impoverish her soul and deny the essential humanity that sustains resilience and wisdom. Yet, even as she confronts the gravity of this choice, she cannot ignore the power of the heart, the subtle ways in which affection nourishes courage, focus, and insight, teaching her patience, empathy, and subtlety, and offering glimpses of joy that are otherwise rare in a life defined by protocol, observation, and relentless responsibility. Victoria's reflection is interrupted by the daily demands of the palace audiences, council, petitions, ceremonial duties, and the constant presence of ministers, courtiers, and advisors, all reminding her that the crown is both symbol and anchor, and that while emotional connection is precious, it must never compromise clarity, judgment, or authority. And in this balance lies the essence of her emerging wisdom, the delicate art of managing both heart and empire, love and duty, desire and obligation. In the gardens, she walks beneath bending branches and fluttering leaves, observing the interplay of sunlight and shadow. And in these quiet moments, she finds perspective, understanding that the human heart, like the gardens themselves, can flourish when tended with care, awareness, and patience, and that it is possible, though fraught with challenge, to integrate personal affection with the responsibilities of monarchy without sacrificing either, provided she moves with intention, foresight, and discretion. Yet, even with this clarity, the emotional tension remains, a quiet undercurrent that pulses beneath the surface of every interaction, decision, and ceremonial act, reminding her that love in the life of a queen is never simple, never private, never entirely safe, and that the reconciliation of heart and duty is an ongoing, intricate negotiation that will test her endurance, perception, and character in ways no law or counsel could prepare her for. And as twilight falls over the palace, casting cinematic shadows across corridors, chambers, and gardens, Victoria stands alone at a window, gazing at the distant spires of the city, feeling both the allure of personal connection and the weight of responsibility pressing down upon her. And she understands that this conflict between desire and duty, though painful, complex, and fraught with riskies, also a forge, shaping her into a sovereign who can feel deeply, act decisively, and navigate the profound complexities of both love and empire with subtlety, insight, and quiet courage, a queen whose heart, while disciplined, will never be entirely silent, and whose reign will reflect the nuanced balance she cultivates between the human and the monumental. Victoria stands at the precipice of choice, where the pull of personal affection collides with the unyielding demands of monarchy, and she feels the weight of both paths pressing down upon her with equal force. For every heartbeat carries the echo of consequence. Every glance and gesture is amplified through the lens of history, and every desire for companionship is shadowed by the responsibility she bears to a nation that sees her not as a woman, but as the embodiment of empire. In her private chambers, she contemplates the delicate balance of intimacy and duty, tracing the lines of letters she has penned but not sent, considering meetings arranged with precision yet fraught with subtle tension, and reflecting on the nature of trust, vulnerability, and the rare gift of genuine connection, knowing that to embrace love fully could bring profound joy yet potentially imperil her authority, and that to deny it entirely could safeguard her position while leaving her heart barren and her spirit quietly unfulfilled. She walks through the palace gardens, where the sun illuminates leaves and flowers in a golden glow, listening to the faint murmur of fountains and the distant song of birds, and in this stillness, she allows herself to feel the complexity of choice, the exhilaration of potential intimacy, the trepidation of exposure, and the steady awareness that her every action, spoken word, and even thought is observed in some form, whether by ministers, courtiers, or the unspoken judgment of history. Victoria recognizes that the crown demands not only endurance and wisdom, but also strategic consideration in matters of the heart, that emotional decisions are inseparable from public consequence, and that the navigation of personal connection requires foresight, patience, and a keen understanding of both human nature and institutional expectation. For to misstep is to risk scandal, distrust, or distraction from the relentless duties of sovereignty. Yet she also acknowledges the rare, vital power of connection, the way trust nurtures courage, the way admiration inspires insight, the way genuine understanding fosters resilience. And she realizes that love, if tempered with prudence and guided by discretion, can enhance rather than diminish the strength of a ruler, providing not weakness, but perspective, grounding, and subtle fortitude in a life otherwise defined by expectation, observation, and duty. As the day stretches into evening, Victoria sits by a window overlooking the palace grounds, the fading light casting cinematic shadows across her chamber, and she contemplates the paths before her, weighing affection against obligation, trust against prudence, desire against legacy, and recognizing that the decisions she makes now will ripple across decades, shaping not only her personal life, but the character of her reign and the perception of the monarchy for generations to come. And in this quiet, reflective moment, framed by the soft melancholy of twilight, Victoria understands that the exercise of the heart is as consequential as the exercise of authority, that love is both risk and reward, and that her ultimate choice will define the depth, humanity, and wisdom of the queen she is becoming, forging a balance between the intimate and the imperial, the vulnerable and the formidable, the human and the sovereign, in a journey as intricate, enduring, and cinematic as the empire she is destined to lead. After weeks of internal deliberation, Victoria reaches a moment where thought must give way to action. A decisive instant where the pull of personal desire and the imperatives of monarchy converge, demanding courage, clarity, and a delicate wisdom. Born from the solitude and observation that have shaped her early reign, she stands in her private chambers, the late afternoon sunlight spilling across polished floors and gilded furniture, the shadows of tall windows stretching long across the room. And she contemplates the consequences of the choice she must make, recognizing that it will reverberate through both her personal life and the very structure of her kingdom. That even the most subtle action can shift perception, inspire loyalty, or provoke intrigue, and that the exercise of the heart is inseparable from the exercise of authority. For in the life of a monarch, love and duty are forever entwined. She recalls the moments of connection that sparked this choice, the quiet smiles exchanged in gardens, the thoughtful conversations, the unspoken understanding that transcended protocol and ceremony. And she feels both exhilaration and apprehension, aware that embracing this connection could bring her the rare gift of companionship, while exposing her to the risks inherent in emotional vulnerability. Yet she also understands that hesitation, suppression, or denial could leave her heart diminished, her spirit quietly constrained, and the richness of human experience unfulfilled. In the gardens she often visits, sunlight flickers through branches, fountains ripple, and birds rise into the air with effortless grace. And she envisions the path ahead with clarity, one in which careful discretion, measured trust, and steadfast awareness of duty allow her to honor both her heart and her crown, to nurture a relationship that strengthens her rather than diminishes her authority, and to experience the subtle joys of intimacy without compromising the stability and perception of her reign. As the palace corridors echo with distant footsteps and ceremonial preparations continue in other wings, Victoria recognizes that her decision must be deliberate, thoughtful, and guided by both emotional authenticity and strategic foresight, that the lessons of observation, patience, and resilience she has cultivated over months of careful study are now to be applied in the most personal of arenas, and that the courage to act is as vital in matters of the heart as it is in matters of state. And so, in the quiet, cinematic glow of late afternoon, she makes her choice, small in gesture but monumental in consequence, a first affirmation that her heart can coexist with her crown, that vulnerability can be an ally rather than a weakness, and that the humanity within a sovereign is as necessary to her strength as wisdom, insight, and authority. Standing at a window overlooking palace gardens, bathed in golden light, Victoria feels a mixture of relief, exhilaration, and solemnity, understanding that this choice, though private, marks a turning point in her journey, a delicate integration of desire and duty, emotion and responsibility, intimacy and sovereignty. And in this singular moment, the young queen perceives the possibilities of a reign that is both powerful and profoundly human, a reign shaped not only by law and ceremony, but by the courage to embrace the first authentic expressions of her own heart. And as dusk falls, casting long cinematic shadows across marble floors and gilded halls, Victoria feels the quiet thrill and weight of what she has done, knowing that this first heartfelt choice is not an endpoint, but the beginning of a lifelong negotiation between love and duty, between self and empire, between the tender stirrings of her heart, a negotiation that will define her as both woman and monarch, shaping the emotional depth, resilience, and legacy of the queen she is becoming. As Victoria's reign progresses, she begins to fully comprehend that the crown is not merely a symbol of power, but a relentless instrument of responsibility, an unyielding force that shapes her every thought, action, and decision, demanding foresight, judgment, and endurance in equal measure. The early exhilaration of authority gradually gives way to the weight of complex governance, for she discovers that ruling an empire spanning continents requires constant attention to politics, diplomacy, and the intricate machinery of law, all while maintaining a presence that inspires confidence and loyalty among subjects and ministers alike, and that the consequences of misjudgment ripple far beyond palace walls, touching lives she may never see and influencing events she cannot control, leaving her with an acute awareness that the crown is both privilege and burden, majesty and constraint. Each morning begins before dawn, Victoria walking through the echoing halls of her palaces, noting the play of sunlight on marble floors, the subtle sway of curtains in the wind, the way shadows fall across gilded portraits of ancestors who seem to judge her every step, and she internalizes the lesson that observation is as critical as action. For a sovereign must interpret not only formal counsel, but also the unspoken intentions, fears, and ambitions of those who surround her, reading between words, gestures, and glances to anticipate the currents that shape policy, alliances, and loyalty. The council chambers become a theater of intellect, strategy, and subtle negotiation, with ministers debating taxation, trade, military deployment, and colonial administration. Each conversation layered with nuance, hidden agendas, and the potential for conflict or compromise, and Victoria learns to balance firmness with tact, decisiveness with patience, and authority with diplomacy, understanding that the art of rulership is less about command than perception, influence, and the judicious application of judgment in every circumstance. Yet the burden of power is not limited to the abstract or institutional. It reaches into the personal, for every decision has moral and ethical weight. Every policy affects lives in ways both immediate and profound, and she confronts the reality that leadership often demands compromise between what is politically expedient and what is ethically sound, between the desires of her subjects and the necessities of governance, forcing her to navigate a world where clarity is rare, choices are fraught, and consequences are enduring. In moments of private reflection, she retreats to palace gardens where fountains ripple, sunlight dances on leaves, and birds soar through the open air, seeking clarity, perspective, and solace. And here, amidst the stillness and the beauty of nature, she contemplates the enormous responsibilities she bears, the expectations that press upon her, and the resilience required to meet them. Understanding that the crown demands both intellect and emotional strength, endurance and empathy, and that the trials she faces will shape not only her reign, but the very essence of her character. The weight of monarchy is magnified by isolation, for though she is surrounded by advisors, courtiers, and attendants, few truly comprehend the pressures she bears, and the loneliness that accompanies authority is constant, a shadow that follows her through corridors, councils, and ceremonies, reminding her that sovereignty is both a public spectacle and a private crucible, one that will test her courage, perception, and endurance at every turn. And as the afternoon light fades into cinematic evening, casting long, reflective shadows across palace halls and gardens, Victoria stands poised, feeling the full magnitude of responsibility pressing upon her shoulders, aware that the burden of power is relentless, yet also understanding that within this weight lies the forge of her resilience, wisdom, and enduring strength, shaping a monarch capable of meeting the demands of empire, navigating the complexities of authority, and carrying the weight of history with dignity, insight, and unyielding resolve. Victoria quickly realizes that the outward appearance of order within her court masks a swirling tempest of ambition, rivalry, and subtle intrigue. For even the most loyal ministers, courtiers, and advisors harbor personal desires and political agendas that sometimes clash with the interests of the crown. And she understands that ruling effectively requires not only intelligence and wisdom, but also an acute sensitivity to human behavior. For a single misjudgment in trust or perception can spark conflict, erode loyalty, or destabilize governance. Council meetings, often staged in grand chambers with sunlight filtering through tall windows and gilded ceilings, become arenas of subtle power plays where voices rise and fall not just on the merits of argument, but on tone, gesture, and the hidden ambitions behind words. And Victoria observes each subtle flicker of expression, each pause, each carefully measured statement, learning to read both spoken content and the invisible undercurrents of tension that swirl around her, understanding that perception often carries as much weight as policy in determining outcomes. Advisors may present well-intentioned counsel, yet conceal personal agendas. Ministers may pursue reforms that serve their families or political factions, and courtiers may whisper rumors, sow doubt, or test the boundaries of influence. And Victoria must navigate these currents with precision, balancing firmness with diplomacy, awareness with discretion, and action with patience. For every choice reverberates far beyond the chamber in which it is made. Yet, within this storm, she also identifies allies, and those whose loyalty is steadfast, individuals whose counsel is genuine and whose motives align with the crown's vision. And she cultivates these relationships with care, understanding that trust, while rare and fragile in a court rife with ambition, is invaluable, providing both insight and support as she negotiates the subtle, high-stakes dynamics of governance. The palace corridors themselves seem alive with intrigue, hushed whispers behind tapestries, the measured steps of courtiers in polished shoes, subtle glances exchanged in hallways, and the faintest changes in tone during audience sessions all signal the shifting allegiances, power struggles, and potential conflicts that Victoria must navigate daily, teaching her to move with awareness, caution, and strategic patience. Even in moments of solitude, she cannot fully escape the influence of courtly tension. 4 letters await her attention. Reports arrive detailing factional disagreements, and every ceremonial gathering becomes both spectacle and test of perception, requiring a careful balance of poise, attentiveness, and discretion, and reinforcing the understanding that the crown, while granting authority, also demands constant vigilance. In her private chambers and palace gardens, Victoria reflects on these experiences, observing the interplay of ambition, loyalty, and human nature as if it were a living tapestry, recognizing that mastery over the court is as much about subtle observation, patience, and timing as it is about formal authority, and that the trials within her own palace will prepare her to navigate larger storms, whether diplomatic, social, or political, that extend beyond her immediate surroundings. And as dusk falls, casting cinematic shadows across corridors and chambers, Victoria stands at a high window, gazing across palace rooftops, feeling both the pressure of intrigue and the exhilaration of strategic mastery, understanding that the storms within the court are both challenge and teacher, shaping her perception, judgment, and resilience, and forging a sovereign capable of navigating complexity with subtlety, courage, and unwavering clarity. Victoria increasingly senses that the true test of monarchy lies not in ceremony or appearance, but in the decisions that shape lives, govern empires, and define legacies. For each choice, no matter how seemingly small, reverberates across nations, affecting both the immediate welfare of subjects and the long-term stability of the realm. And she understands that the responsibility of judgment is relentless, unyielding, and often accompanied by profound isolation, as no one can share fully the burden of the crown or the consequences of sovereign authority. In council chambers, Victoria listens intently as ministers and advisors debate issues ranging from taxation and trade to military deployment and colonial administration, weighing the merit of their arguments while also observing posture, tone, hesitation, and the subtle signals that reveal personal ambition, hidden motives, or unspoken fears. And she learns to synthesize information not only from logic and fact, but also from intuition, perception, and human insight, recognizing that the exercise of judgment is as much an art as a science. The young queen's days are a careful choreography of observation and action. She must decide when to assert authority decisively and when to delay, when to offer compromise and when to hold firm, when to trust advisors and when to question their intentions. And in each moment, she feels the immense weight of responsibility, the awareness that miscalculation can lead to unrest, weakened alliances, or diminished authority, and that her choices will ripple outward, shaping the empire she governs and the perception of her reign for generations. Yet the burden of decision-making is not limited to policy alone. It extends to matters of personal significance, including the delicate interplay between affection, trust, and duty. And she realizes that her emotional judgments must also be tempered by discretion, insight, and awareness of consequence. For the intertwining of personal and political spheres is constant, and the consequences of misjudgment can affect both realms simultaneously. In moments of solitude, Victoria seeks clarity by walking through palace gardens, observing the interplay of sunlight and shadow, the delicate sway of fountains, and the rhythmic flight of birds, finding in nature a metaphor for balance, perspective, and the patient unfolding of events. And she draws from these observations the resilience and calm necessary to make difficult choices, understanding that a monarch's strength is measured not by the absence of uncertainty, but by the capacity to act decisively despite it. As evening descends, casting cinematic shadows across marble corridors and gilded halls, Victoria contemplates the long arc of consequences that emanate from each decision, reflecting on the moral, ethical, and strategic weight carried by her authority, and she recognizes that mastery of governance requires a synthesis of intellect, observation, empathy, and courage, an integration of reason and intuition that allows her to navigate complexity with clarity and resolve. And in the quiet, cinematic glow of the palace, Victoria stands at a high window, looking out across rooftops, gardens, and the distant city, feeling both the gravity and the clarity that accompany decisive action. Aware that the weight of decisions is not a burden to escape, but a crucible in which judgment, resilience, and the essence of sovereign character are forged, shaping a queen capable of sustaining authority, inspiring loyalty, and carrying the responsibilities of empire with unwavering insight, dignity, and measured strength. A sudden crisis tests Victoria's burgeoning skill and composure, a stark reminder that monarchy is not a series of ceremonies and decisions on paper, but a living, breathing responsibility in which every action carries consequence, and that a sovereign must remain vigilant, perceptive, and resolute at all times. For the stakes extend far beyond personal comfort or ambition, touching the lives of millions across continents and colonies. The crisis may take many forms: political unrest, a contentious dispute among ministers, or news of tension in distant territories, and each scenario forces her to confront uncertainty, navigate conflicting advice, and make decisions under pressure, balancing the immediate needs of governance with the long-term implications of her actions, and understanding that delay, hesitation, or miscalculation could have catastrophic effects on both the stability of the realm and her perception as a ruler. Victoria rises early, before the first light of dawn, pacing corridors that echo with history and weight, reviewing reports, considering counsel, and weighing the potential consequences of each course of action. Her mind a meticulous instrument, honed by months of observation, reflection, and practice, parsing not only facts but also the subtle signals of loyalty, ambition, fear, and intent in those who surround her. Recognizing that a sovereign's judgment is constantly measured, not just by outcomes, but by perception, by the confidence inspired or undermined in those she leads. In council chambers, ministers present conflicting strategies, each layered with nuance, hidden motives, and personal agendas. And Victoria must filter rhetoric from reality, counsel from self, and immediate expedience from long-term consequence, applying both intellect and intuition, insight and discernment, to determine a course of action that balances justice, prudence, and authority, while also maintaining the cohesion of her court and the loyalty of her people. Yet, even as the external pressures mount, the crisis also illuminates Victoria's inner strength, revealing resilience forged through solitude, observation, and earlier trials, a capacity to remain composed in the face of ambiguity, to navigate the storm of personalities, expectations, and risk with clarity, and to act decisively while maintaining the dignity, empathy, and authority demanded by her station, demonstrating that leadership is as much a matter of character as strategy. In rare moments of quiet, she retreats to palace gardens or sunlit corridors, observing nature's patterns, the ripple of fountains, the sway of trees. The unhurried flight of birdsand draws parallels to her own governance, understanding that crises, like the natural world, are cyclical, requiring patience, measured response, and adaptive resilience, and that a queen's strength is revealed not only in her triumphs, but in her capacity to endure, reflect, and resolve under pressure. And as dusk settles over the palace, casting cinematic shadows across corridors, chambers, and gardens, Victoria stands alone at a high window, gazing at the empire she guides, feeling both the weight and clarity that crises bring, and recognizing that in navigating danger, ambiguity, and tension, she has discovered a deeper layer of her own character, a refined capacity for judgment, courage, and quiet authority, the subtle yet unshakable foundation upon which the enduring strength of her reign will rest, a sovereign tempered by challenge, poised to meet the storms of leadership with resilience, insight, and unwavering resolve. As the immediate crisis fades into memory, Victoria reflects on the lessons embedded in challenge, recognizing that the trials she has faced are not obstacles, but instruments that forge resilience, wisdom, and a deepened capacity for leadership. For the crown demands not only intellect and judgment, but also an unyielding fortitude capable of withstanding uncertainty, conflict, and the unrelenting pressures of empire. She walks through palace corridors bathed in late afternoon light, the echo of her footsteps a reminder of both solitude and responsibility, and contemplates the countless choices she has made, decisions weighed, risks calculated, alliances navigated, and the realization settles within her that strength is not merely the exercise of authority, but the integration of discernment, patience, and courage, the capacity to act decisively while honoring justice, loyalty, and the intricate dynamics of human behavior. Victoria recalls moments in council chambers when ministers and advisors presented opposing counsel, each argument layered with hidden motives and ambition, and she reflects on the clarity required to filter truth from centrist, weighing policy against principle and consequence against expedience, and she feels the subtle thrill of mastery tempered by humility, knowing that the mantle of sovereignty is as much a crucible of character as it is a position of influence. In the palace gardens, where sunlight plays upon leaves and fountains ripple gently, Victoria finds solace and perspective, observing the harmony and resilience of nature and drawing metaphorical parallels to her own reign, the strength to bend without breaking, to adapt without yielding, and to endure with grace. Understanding that leadership is a living, breathing practice, requiring constant attention, reflection, and growth, and that every challenge strengthens the foundation upon which her authority rests. Yet the forging of strength is accompanied by the awareness of isolation. For few truly comprehend the burdens of decision, the pressures of scrutiny, or the moral weight carried by a monarch. And Victoria acknowledges that resilience is cultivated not in public praise or ceremony, but in the quiet moments of reflection, in the solitary assessment of risk, and in the capacity to confront uncertainty without relinquishing composure or clarity. As dusk approaches, cinematic shadows stretch across corridors and gardens, and Victoria pauses at a high window, looking across the sprawling city below, feeling both the gravity and the exhilaration of her own growth, aware that the trials she has endured have sharpened her insight, refined her judgment, and strengthened the subtle authority that underpins her reign. For true power is measured not only in the execution of policy, but in the capacity to navigate adversity with dignity, foresight, and unwavering resilience. And in this moment, Victoria perceives the intertwining of challenge and opportunity, understanding that crises, conflicts, and the relentless demands of sovereignty are not hindrances but teachers, shaping a queen who can act with clarity, lead with wisdom, and endure with courage. A sovereign whose authority is balanced by insight, whose decisions are informed by observation and empathy, and whose reign is defined not only by the power she wields, but by the quiet, unshakable strength forged in trial, a foundation upon which the enduring legacy of her empire and her character will be built for generations to come. As Victoria's reign reaches maturity, she begins to feel the profound weight of legacy pressing upon her, the awareness that every decision, every gesture, every act of governance will echo far beyond her own lifetime, shaping not only the perception of her reign, but the structure, stability, and spirit of an empire that spans continents and generations. And she recognizes that the crown is not a temporary privilege, but a responsibility with enduring consequences, a living testament to the delicate balance between authority, morality, and human insight. She walks through palace corridors lined with portraits of ancestors whose faces seem to observe, evaluate, and silently judge her. And in their painted eyes, she sees both the history she inherits and the standard she is expected to uphold. A continuous dialogue between past and present that demands reflection, courage, and meticulous attention to the subtle interplay of tradition, innovation, and ethical responsibility. Victoria contemplates the countless events, policies, and moments of personal choice that have defined her journey, the careful navigation of courtly intrigue, the cultivation of allies and confidants, the management of crises, both domestic and foreign, and the delicate balance between personal desire and sovereign duty. And she realizes that legacy is neither accidental nor inevitable, but actively forged in the decisions, sacrifices, and values she enshrines in her reign, and that the mark of a monarch is measured not merely in power exercised, but in enduring influence, moral clarity, and the inspiration of those who follow. In private reflection, often in sun-dappled gardens or silent chambers, she contemplates the personal dimensions of her legacy, the relationships nurtured, the trusts honored, the hearts guided, and the moments of courage in which she acted not only as a sovereign, but as a woman aware of her humanity, aware that the strength of character cultivated in solitude, observation, and trial will resonate across time, influencing perceptions of leadership, virtue, and resilience for generations to come. Yet legacy is also public, a delicate tapestry woven from perception, diplomacy, and the maintenance of stability. And Victoria understands that her reputation and influence are shaped as much by appearances, ceremony, and communication as by formal policy. For history is written not only by events, but by the stories told, the impressions formed, and the confidence inspired in subjects, advisors, and foreign powers alike. And a sovereign must navigate these intangible realms with care, insight, and subtlety. She reflects on the lessons learned through triumph and adversity, realizing that endurance, empathy, observation, and decisiveness are the pillars upon which a meaningful legacy rests. That human connection enhances rather than diminishes authority, and that the integration of heart and duty, emotion and responsibility is the hallmark of leadership capable of transcending time. As evening falls, casting cinematic shadows across palace halls and gardens, Victoria stands at a high window, gazing at the sprawling empire that stretches far beyond her sight, feeling the weight, gravity, and possibility inherent in her role, aware that each action she takes, each choice she enacts, is a thread in the tapestry of history, a stitch that will bind the story of her reign to the future of a nation and an empire. And she senses that the consciousness of legacy is both a burden and a guiding light, a responsibility that sharpens judgment, inspires courage, and elevates the practice of leadership into an art that is as human as it is sovereign, shaping the queen she has become and the history that will remember her. Victoria begins to contemplate the true nature of power, understanding that it is not solely the enforcement of law, the signing of decrees, or the orchestration of ceremonies, but the subtle, almost imperceptible influence that radiates from presence, perception, and principle, a force that shapes minds, inspires loyalty, and sustains the delicate balance of authority and respect across her vast empire. As she moves through the palace corridors, sunlight filtering through stained glass windows, she observes the patterns of human behavior: courtiers bowing, ministers strategizing, servants quietly attending to details, and she realizes that influence flows in every interaction, in gestures, expressions, and the careful calibration of words and actions, teaching her that leadership is as much about perception and inspiration as it is about power formally exercised, and that the ability to guide, persuade, and nurture trust is the foundation upon which enduring sovereignty rests. In the council chambers, she recalls the countless hours spent listening, questioning, and weighing counsel, discerning the intentions behind arguments, understanding both the explicit and implicit motivations of those who surround her, and learning that influence is subtle, layered, and often invisible, yet potent enough to shape policy, alliances, and public perception, and that true authority is measured not merely in command, but in the capacity to guide without coercion, to act with vision while maintaining confidence, and to lead with empathy while preserving respect. Beyond the formalities of governance, Victoria reflects on the personal dimensions of influence, the ways in which her demeanor, insight, and emotional intelligence shape relationships, nurture trust, and inspire courage, both within the palace walls and across distant lands, reminding her that the human element of leadership is as vital as the institutional, that compassion, clarity, and integrity enhance power rather than diminish it, and that a sovereign who understands this delicate interplay can achieve far more than one who relies solely on authority or position. She walks in palace gardens, the soft murmur of fountains and the whisper of leaves providing a quiet counterpoint to the weight of her thoughts, contemplating how influence, like sunlight filtering through branches, can illuminate, guide, and nurture growth if wielded with awareness, patience, and subtlety, and that the measure of a monarch is found not only in the grand gestures of governance, but in the quiet, consistent application of insight, discernment, and principle in daily life. As the evening deepens, casting long cinematic shadows across corridors, gardens, and marble floors, Victoria senses the duality of power and influence, the responsibility to act decisively when necessary, and the wisdom to guide gently when possible, the courage to enforce authority, and the foresight to cultivate loyalty, and the understanding that every action, no matter how minor, resonates beyond the moment, shaping perceptions, relationships, and ultimately, history. Standing at a tall window, she gazes at the city and empire stretching toward the horizon, feeling the weight of both immediate responsibility and enduring legacy. And she realizes that influence is an extension of character, judgment, and resilience, a force that can fortify the empire, inspire the people, and elevate the sovereignty of a queen whose authority is defined not only by law and ceremony, but by insight, empathy, and the enduring capacity to understand and guide the human heart. And in this reflective twilight, Victoria perceives that power, when harmonized with wisdom and tempered by observation and empathy, becomes not only a tool of governance, but a living expression of enduring leadership, one capable of shaping both the present and the generations that will inherit her vision, a testament to the subtle, profound, and cinematic force of influence wielded with clarity and purpose. Despite the grandeur, the protocol, and the unrelenting scrutiny that define her reign, Victoria becomes acutely aware that true sovereignty is as much about humanity as it is about authority. For the crown may grant power, but it cannot insulate her from the complexity of emotion, the weight of conscience, or the profound responsibilities toward the people who live under her rule. In quiet moments within her private chambers or amidst the palace gardens, she reflects on the delicate balance between duty and empathy, recognizing that a queen's strength is measured not only by her capacity to make law, navigate politics, or command respect, but also by her ability to feel deeply, understand others, and act with a moral compass that guides decisions beyond expediency or ambition. She recalls the faces of those affected by policies she has enacted, the lives altered by taxation, reform, or military decisions, and feels the gravity of choices that extend far beyond the ceremonial spectacle. Understanding that leadership is inseparable from responsibility for human consequence, and that true wisdom requires both discernment and compassion, intellect and heart. As she walks through palace corridors, sunlight streaming through high windows illuminates her thoughtful expression, the long shadows echoing the weight of reflection, and she contemplates the interplay between her personal experiences and the empathy that governs her engagement with the world, realizing that moments of quiet reflection, observation, and solitude are essential to nurture the human side of sovereignty, providing perspective, restraint, and the moral clarity necessary to wield power responsibly. Even the smallest interactions with ministers, courtiers, visitors, or citizens become opportunities to exercise judgment informed by understanding and consideration. Each conversation, gesture, or decision, a reminder that the strength of a ruler is inseparable from her capacity to relate to the human experiences of fear, hope, grief, and joy, and that empathy enhances authority rather than diminishes it, forging loyalty and inspiring trust in ways that formal power alone cannot achieve. In her gardens, Victoria observes the rhythm of nature, the sway of leaves, the ripple of fountains, the flight of birds, and recognizes that human leadership, like nature, thrives when nurtured with care, patience, and respect for subtle forces, that resilience, judgment, and authority flourish when tempered with humanity, and that the most enduring leaders are those who embrace both the burdens and the beauty of human connection within their rule. she considers the tension between personal desires and sovereign obligations, the moments when affection, trust, or companionship intersect with the duties of monarchy, and she understands that to acknowledge her own humanity is not weakness, but a profound source of strength, enabling her to navigate courtly intrigue, political crises, and public scrutiny with clarity, authenticity, and courage. As dusk falls over palace gardens, corridors, and chambers, cinematic shadows stretching across marble floors and gilded walls, Victoria stands alone at a high window, gazing at the empire sprawling beneath her. And in this reflective silence, she perceives the truth of her own sovereignty, that authority gains depth, resilience, and enduring legitimacy when guided by empathy, tempered by moral awareness, and harmonized with the human experiences that define both her subjects and herself. A queen whose reign is not only measured in power exercised, but in the wisdom, compassion, and quiet strength that radiate from the human side of her sovereignty. As Victoria ages and her reign stretches across decades, she increasingly contemplates the passage of time, feeling the quiet gravity of history pressing alongside the immediacy of her duties. For each day represents both a fleeting moment and a lasting contribution to the story of the empire and the legacy she leaves behind. In the stillness of her private chambers or the dappled light of palace gardens, she reflects on the years that have shaped her from the youthful queen who stepped timidly into authority, to the sovereign tempered by trials, crises, and the delicate negotiation of duty and heart. And she sees in the reflection of polished glass and mirrored corridors the evolution of a leader whose understanding of power, humanity, and responsibility has deepened with every challenge faced. She recalls moments of personal joy and private sorrow, the friendships nurtured and the betrayals endured, the careful balancing of desire and duty, and the intricate web of political, social, and familial obligations that have defined her days. Understanding that time does not merely pass, but shapes, molds, and sometimes tests the very essence of character, revealing strengths and vulnerabilities alike, and compelling her to act with foresight, patience, and moral clarity. In audience chambers and council rooms, Victoria observes the younger ministers and courtiers, the new generation rising into positions of influence, and she perceives the subtle ways in which her decisions, guidance, and example ripple across time, shaping both the immediate course of events and the future conduct of those who will inherit the responsibilities of governance, a living testament to the enduring impact of leadership exercised with insight and conscience. In quieter moments, she walks through palace gardens, watching sunlight dance on fountains, shadows elongate over lawns, and birds rise and settle in their rhythmic cycles. And she draws parallels between the natural passage of seasons and the arc of human life, understanding that sovereignty is a continuum, a succession of choices, lessons, and reflections that accumulate into legacy, and that awareness of time's inexorable movement heightens both the humility and the intentionality with which she governs. Victoria also reflects on the personal dimensions of time, the fleeting beauty of private companionship, the subtle joys of observation, the delicate moments of connection that contrast with the rigidity of ceremony and expectation. And she realizes that these experiences, though often invisible to the public eye, have shaped her judgment, informed her empathy, and enriched her capacity to rule with humanity, insight, and wisdom, providing a quiet but vital counterbalance to the responsibilities of power. As evening descends, casting cinematic shadows across the palace corridors and gardens, Victoria pauses at a high window, gazing at the sprawling city, distant hills, and the lights that begin to punctuate the twilight, feeling both the weight and the gift of the years she has lived, the trials endured, the joys experienced, and the legacy slowly unfolding beneath her gaze. And she perceives that the reflection of time is not merely an exercise in memory, but a vital compass, guiding decisions, shaping empathy, and illuminating the path of leadership in a world where each moment, choice, and interaction resonates far beyond the present. In this cinematic twilight, Victoria understands that to reflect on time is to embrace both responsibility and humanity, to honor the lessons of the past while stewarding the present with clarity and courage, and to prepare the legacy of a reign that is as profoundly human as it is sovereign. A reign sculpted by experience, endurance, and the reflective wisdom of decades spent balancing crown, heart, and empire. As Victoria reflects on the twilight of her reign, she perceives the crown not merely as an object of authority, but as a living symbol, an eternal presence that has shaped her identity, her decisions, and the very contours of her life. A weight both tangible and invisible, grounding her in duty while extending her influence across generations. And she understands that the crown is inseparable from her essence, entwined with both her triumphs and her sacrifices. In the quiet of her chambers, the flickering candlelight casting long, cinematic shadows on walls lined with portraits, she contemplates the enormity of responsibility she has carried, the countless decisions that have rippled across continents, and the delicate interplay between power and morality that has defined her reign. Knowing that a sovereign's authority is not merely the right to command, but the capacity to inspire, guide, and endure with integrity, resilience, and vision. She recalls the private moments that sustained her through rare instances of trust, companionship, and reflection that allowed her heart to flourish amidst duty. The fleeting joys that contrasted the endless expectations of empire, and the lessons drawn from adversity, intrigue, and personal struggle, each shaping her perception of both humanity and sovereignty, and reminding her that leadership is not solely a matter of decree, ceremony, or spectacle, but of empathy, courage, and the conscious integration of heart and mind. Victoria also contemplates the broader arc of history, the generations she has influenced, the lives touched by her policies, and the subtle yet enduring legacies of her judgments, alliances, and moral choices. Realizing that the crown is more than a symbol of power, is a responsibility to the living and a promise to the future, a tangible connection between past traditions and the unfolding narrative of a nation, a reminder that true authority is measured not in control alone, but in the capacity to wield influence wisely, justly, and compassionately. In her palace gardens, where fountains ripple gently, trees sway in the wind, and sunlight filters through leaves, Victoria finds the quiet clarity that has guided her for decades, understanding that the crown, like nature itself, demands balance, patience, and attentiveness, and that the strength of a sovereign emerges not from fear or dominance, but from the harmonious integration of wisdom, humanity, and steadfast resolve. qualities honed over years of navigating crises, observing human nature, and reflecting upon both personal and political consequence. As the final light of day fades, casting cinematic shadows across marble corridors and gilded halls, Victoria stands at a high window, gazing at the empire that stretches to the horizon, feeling the eternal weight and luminous significance of the crown upon her. Aware that she is both a human being and a symbol, both vulnerable and formidable, and that the endurance, insight, and subtle authority she has cultivated will resonate far beyond her lifetime, shaping the perception of monarchy and inspiring generations to come. In this profound moment, Victoria perceives the eternal truth of sovereignty, that the crown is not only a burden, but a vessel through which resilience, empathy, and wisdom can manifest, a living testament to the delicate, cinematic, and enduring interplay between heart, mind, and empire, a symbol that transcends time, and a reminder that the legacy of a monarch is etched not only in law, ceremony, and history, but in the humanity, courage, and vision she brings to the eternal duty of the crown.